November 7, 1944, 3rd Armored Division Maintenance Area, Stolberg, Germany. A battered Sherman tank sat in the depot, its transmission ripped apart and scattered on the cold floor. Official records labeled it as beyond repair, a full mechanical write-off. M4A3, serial number 3051874, had broken its final drive for the third time in just 2 months, a failure that haunted many Shermans in the harsh German winter. Normally, any mechanic would have signed the forms, declared it dead, and walked away. But Technical Sergeant Curtis Hammond stood in front of the wreck with a familiar look, one his team recognized as a warning. At 32 years old, Hammond had once been a moonshine runner in rural East Tennessee, and he had learned more about engines while racing away from federal officers than any textbook could ever teach him. "He's about to pull some crazy stunt again," Private James Murphy muttered to Corporal David Chen. Just a month earlier, Hammond had reworked 3 half-tracks to run on captured German gasoline. With a mischievous grin, Hammond turned to his crew. "Gentlemen," he said in a thick Tennessee accent, "this tank is about to become the fastest Sherman in the entire European theater. I'm going to make her outrun a Jeep." His men froze. Then came uneasy laughter. A Sherman weighed 33 tons, topped out at roughly 26 miles per hour, and was often sluggish even at that. Meanwhile, a Jeep could hit 65 miles per hour. What Hammond claimed sounded absurd. "Sergeant, that's mechanically impossible," Chen finally said. "The drivetrain can't take that kind of strain. You'll get court-martialed if you try." Hammond's smile grew even larger. "Probably," he replied. "But this tank's already junk. We're losing more vehicles to breakdowns than to enemy fire. And I know something about this Continental R975 engine that Detroit never figured out. She's got another 200 horsepower still hiding in her." For months, Hammond had secretly experimented with Sherman engines, and he had discovered something remarkable: the Sherman's entire powertrain was capable of far more than its rated performance. The engine was advertised as 400 horsepower strictly for reliability purposes. But Hammond, who spent his youth squeezing unbelievable power out of moonshine running cars, believed that reliability limits were nothing more than wasted capability. Curtis Hammond's path from outlaw mechanic to Army sergeant began in March 1942, when he was arrested for the 14th time by federal agents. Standing before a judge, he was given a choice: 5 years in prison or joining the U.S. Army. Hammond chose military service. At Fort Knox, his talent became obvious. He could pinpoint mechanical issues just by hearing an engine run. His instructors admired his skills but were unsettled by his complete refusal to follow standard procedures. Hammond dismissed manuals, saying, "Those books are written by people who never had to keep an engine running while revenuers are firing at your taillights." By September 1943, Hammond had attained the rank of technical sergeant, despite 17 reprimands for unauthorized modifications and 43 charges of insubordination. Yet 3 battalion commanders praised him for keeping their vehicles operational through unconventional methods. Normandy would teach Hammond a harsh truth. When the 3rd Armored Division landed at Omaha Beach on June 23, 1944, they learned quickly that the most dangerous enemy wasn't always German firepower, but constant mechanical breakdowns. Sherman tanks constantly suffered breakdowns. For every one knocked out by enemy fire, 2 others were rendered useless because of mechanical issues. Hammond eventually abandoned strict regulations and devoted himself fully to keeping tanks running by any means necessary. When replacement parts weren't available, he manufactured them himself. When manuals claimed a repair couldn't be done, he did it anyway. And most controversially, he started increasing engine output. While studying the Continental R975, Hammond figured out that it was nearly the same as aircraft engines capable of producing up to 550 horsepower. The difference wasn't in its construction, but merely in the way it was tuned. With secret late-night testing on tanks already marked as scrap, he proved his theory. A Sherman usually limited to 26 miles per hour suddenly reached 32 miles per hour, with noticeably faster acceleration. In September 1944, Captain Robert Morrison confronted him. "Sergeant Hammond, you've been performing unauthorized modifications that go against regulations. Your changes void warranties and may undermine reliability." Hammond answered without hesitation. "Sir, warranties don't matter when tanks are breaking down more than they're being shot. I'm not hurting reliability, I'm making it better. These engines are tuned so far below what they're capable of that they actually become less dependable." Morrison found himself unable to refute the results. Hammond's upgraded tanks were performing better, with no added risk of failure. "I can't officially approve what you're doing," Morrison finally admitted. "But I won't interfere as long as it keeps working. If the division discovers this, you'll be facing a court-martial." "Understood?" "Perfectly understood, sir," Hammond replied. By November 1944, Hammond began planning something beyond anything he had attempted before. He intended to completely redefine what a Sherman tank could accomplish. For 6 weeks, working through the night, he rebuilt Sherman's serial number 3051874 from the inside out. He raised the engine's compression ratio from 6.7 to 8.5 by remachining the cylinder heads. He reworked the carburetor with fuel jets taken from a captured German aircraft. He advanced the ignition timing by 8 degrees. Most daring of all, he altered the supercharger to boost pressure by 20%. To withstand the surge in power, Hammond strengthened the tank's transmission using steel salvaged from a destroyed Panther. He changed gear ratios to support higher speeds and reinforced the final drives with extra armor plates. He upgraded the suspension with heavier springs taken from M10 tank destroyers and modified the shock absorbers to handle the additional stress. By December 20th, the rebuilt Sherman stood ready. The first trial run took place at 0200 hours on December 21st. Hammond assembled a volunteer crew, Murphy as driver, Chen as assistant driver, Jackson as gunner, Foster as loader, and Hammond himself as commander. When the engine started, the Continental didn't purr, it growled with a deeper, more aggressive tone than any Sherman they had ever heard. Murphy shifted into gear and pushed forward. Once they passed 20 miles per hour, they were already beyond normal Sherman performance limits. At 25 miles per hour, they were already exceeding the official top speed of the Sherman. Murphy's face was lit with excitement. "Sergeant, she's still got power to spare," he shouted. "Keep pushing it," Hammond instructed. At 35 miles per hour, Murphy's excitement shifted into total disbelief. At 40 miles per hour, they entered a speed range normally reserved for Jeeps. At 45 miles per hour, Chen reported from his instruments. "Sergeant, the engine temperature is climbing, but still safe. Oil pressure is stable. The engine is loving this." When they hit 47 miles per hour, they passed the timing marker. Murphy hit the brakes. The entire crew sat in silent shock. Then Murphy burst into laughter. "We just hit 47 in a Sherman tank. Nobody on Earth is going to believe this." Hammond then checked every part of the machine personally, track alignment, suspension, engine performance, everything was functioning normally. He had just created a Sherman tank capable of outrunning a Jeep. 3 days later, Sherman's serial number 3051874, now unofficially named Moonshiner, was ordered into divisional reserve. The Battle of the Bulge had erupted on December 16th, and the Army needed every single functioning tank. Captain Morrison confronted Hammond. "Sergeant, every working tank is being deployed. That modified tank is yours, correct?" "Yes, sir." "If this machine fails in combat, I will personally see that you spend the rest of your life in Leavenworth," Morrison warned. "But if it saves American lives, I'll recommend you for a medal. The tank goes into battle, and so do you." If you're enjoying stories about unsanctioned wartime ingenuity, make sure to subscribe to this channel. We share unbelievable, little-known World War II events that show how individual skill changed the course of history. Subscribe for weekly deep investigative history stories just like this one. Hammond then selected his combat crew. Murphy remained the driver, Chen stayed as assistant driver. He brought in combat-experienced gunner Johnson and loader O'Brien. Christmas Eve was spent preparing Moonshiner for war. They loaded 97 rounds of 75mm ammunition, thousands of machine gun rounds, filled fuel tanks to capacity, and double-checked all systems. By midnight, the tank was fully combat ready. On Christmas morning, the 3rd Armored Division headed south. The weather was bitterly cold, dropping below 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and the tanks crawled forward across frozen roads. On December 27th, near Hotten, Belgium, Moonshiner finally faced the test Hammond had built it for. A German Kampfgruppe had smashed through American defenses, threatening to encircle 2 infantry regiments. Moonshiner joined 16 other tanks tasked with stopping them. Intelligence estimated at least a dozen Panthers, along with self-propelled guns and motorized infantry. The Americans were outmatched. Panthers had superior armor, optics, and firepower, but the Germans had no idea they were about to face a Sherman unlike anything they had ever encountered. The American tanks set up an ambush, with Moonshiner positioned at the far flank. Hammond requested the position on purpose, his strategy depended on mobility. At 1,400 hours, German armor was spotted at 800 yards. The trap was sprung. 16 Shermans fired in unison. The leading Panther took 3 hits and stalled. A second Panther fired its 88mm cannon once, and a Sherman vanished in an explosion. In less than 3 minutes, 4 American tanks were burning. 2 Panthers had been disabled. The battle was tipping against the Americans. Engaging Panthers on their own battlefield terms was a losing strategy. Hammond analyzed the situation with a calm mind. A new tactic was required. He spoke through the intercom to Murphy. "Do you remember how fast this machine really is?" Murphy replied, "How could I possibly forget, Sergeant?" Hammond answered firmly, "Good. We're going to flank their entire line at maximum speed. Things are about to get intense." Without hesitation, Murphy slammed his foot down on the accelerator. Moonshine Runner surged forward, the upgraded engine roaring with tremendous force. The 33-ton tank accelerated with astonishing quickness. German officers spotted the single-charging Sherman, but saw no reason to worry. A lone tank rushing forward meant suicide. Several Panther turrets turned to engage, but something unusual was happening. The Sherman moved with unreal speed, accelerating like a small reconnaissance vehicle. At 30 miles per hour, Moonshine Runner was already moving too fast for Panther guns to track accurately. German gunners watched their shots miss wildly as the tank passed the limit of turret traverse. At 35 miles per hour, the Sherman blurred across their flank like a tracked vehicle far lighter than its weight. Hammond's strategy was straightforward. On any battlefield, the fastest machine usually wins. He wasn't trying to trade fire at normal combat distance. He intended to use speed to reach the Panthers from behind, where their armor was weakest. In a minute and a half, Moonshine Runner covered 1,200 yards, sweeping around the German formation at speeds too fast for Panther commanders to respond to. Some fired desperately at the racing Sherman, but hitting a tank traveling over 35 miles per hour was essentially impossible. Moonshine Runner emerged behind the German force, right where their thin rear armor was exposed. Hammond shouted, "Stop!" Then, Gunner, 3 Panthers. Rear armor. Range between 400 and 600 yards. Every shot must hit. Johnson, a combat-experienced gunner, swung the turret smoothly, locked onto the nearest Panther, and fired. The armor-piercing round smashed into the engine deck, ripping through the weaker plating. The Panther stalled, its crew scrambling to escape. Johnson rotated to the second target and fired again. The shot penetrated, and this Panther exploded violently, its turret blown upward. The third Panther tried desperately to rotate its turret, but Johnson fired before it could line up. Another confirmed kill. In half a minute, Moonshine Runner eliminated 3 Panthers. The shock rattled the German force. They were suddenly being destroyed from their rear by a tank that shouldn't have been there, moving with a speed no one expected. Their organized attack collapsed into chaos. The German advance halted and began to fall apart. American armor pushed forward, pressing the advantage. The firefight lasted about 20 minutes. 8 Panthers were destroyed in total. A Moonshine Runner claimed 3 of those kills. 4 more German vehicles were disabled. U.S. losses totaled 6 Shermans. Hammond examined Moonshine Runner afterward. The extreme maneuvers had pushed the tank to its limits, but the upgrades were holding strong. The engine ran hot, but within safe range. Oil pressure remained stable. The transmission performed perfectly. The impossible had been achieved, speed had saved them, and the tank had survived the ordeal. The story spread quickly through the division. By nightfall, Hammond was ordered to report to headquarters, expecting to face military punishment. Instead, Brigadier General Doyle Hickey was reviewing the reports. "Sergeant Hammond," he began. "My officers report that your Sherman maneuvered at unbelievable speeds. German captives claim they faced a new kind of supertank. I'm also informed you made these modifications without authorization. Explain," the officer demanded. Hammond chose to answer with complete honesty. He stated, "Sir, I've enhanced the tank's capabilities by altering compression ratios, fuel flow, supercharger boost levels, and ignition timing. I also strengthened the transmission system. These changes break standard rules, but they function effectively." The officer pressed further. "How much improvement?" Hammond replied, "A normal Sherman reaches a top speed of 26 miles per hour, sir. My modified version reaches between 45 and 48. It accelerates more quickly, climbs rough terrain better, and sustains speed even off-road. The total cost for these upgrades is $72 per tank, and installation requires 4 days. The officer asked, and reliability? Hammond answered confidently, they're actually more reliable, sir. The Continental engine is built to handle up to 400 horsepower. It performs most efficiently, producing between 450 and 500 horsepower. When operating at its true design point, the engine's lifespan increases. General Hickey made a decision without hesitation. Officially, I know nothing about this. If these upgrades fail, you will face a court-martial. Unofficially, I want you to train our mechanics to do exactly what you've done. We will convert 20 tanks as a pilot project. Captain Morrison will supply everything you need. Do you have any questions? Hammond asked a single one, sir, what name should I use formally for these improvements? Hickey grinned. Call it the Tank Performance Enhancement Program. For 6 weeks, Hammond personally instructed 8 mechanics on how to perform each upgrade. The training involved direct hands-on work, with Hammond overseeing every task. Every step was recorded in detail, removing the engine, machining the cylinder head, modifying the carburetor, advancing ignition timing, enhancing the supercharger, reinforcing the transmission, strengthening the final drive components, and upgrading the suspension system. By mid-February 1945, all 20 modified Shermans were ready and distributed across the 3rd Armored Division. Hammond accompanied multiple combat missions to observe how they performed. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive. Tank crews praised the acceleration and speed, commanders valued the newfound tactical freedom, and the upgraded vehicles excelled in quick response actions, flanking operations, and disengaging from dangerous fights. Mechanical durability matched Hammond's promise. The modified tanks averaged 1,500 miles between breakdowns, similar to unmodified Sherman standards. The return on investment was striking. A $72 cost in 4 days of work produced a 35% improvement in mobility. Hammond's upgrades were small adjustments individually, but together they delivered a meaningful strategic advantage. Soon, more units requested the modifications. However, Hammond recognized a serious issue: only experienced mechanics could reliably perform the upgrades. Less skilled attempts often led to failure. In March 1945, Hammond delivered a briefing at Army Ground Forces headquarters in Paris. Present were 2 colonels, 1 brigadier general, and 3 engineers from the Ordnance Department. Hammond explained his developments with confidence, presenting the technical principles, combat results from 43 missions, and a full overview of procedures while responding to every challenge raised. The civilian engineers doubted his claims, insisting the Continental engine could not safely generate such power levels. Hammond responded respectfully, "Gentlemen, I am not making assumptions. I am presenting results from 3 full months of combat performance," Hammond stated firmly. "You're insisting the engine cannot do this. I'm showing you what it has already done in battle. There's a clear distinction between theoretical limitations and real-world outcomes." Brigadier General Thomas Rodriguez stepped in. The sergeant makes a valid argument. "We can argue over theory all day, but he has actual battlefield proof. I recommend official testing at the Aberdeen Proving Ground. If the upgrades work as he claims, we adopt them. If they don't, we terminate the idea." 2 weeks later at Aberdeen, government technicians tested a modified Sherman with exhaustive procedures. For 3 days straight, they measured and evaluated every system. The findings confirmed Hammond's claims entirely. The recorded top speed reached 46.2 miles per hour. Acceleration from 0 to 30 miles per hour dropped to 23 seconds instead of the usual 41. Hill climbing ability improved by 37%. A 500-mile endurance trial finished without a single malfunction. The formal test report filed on April 9, 1945, declared that Hammond's upgrades provided significant battlefield advantages at very low cost with acceptable durability. The report recommended immediate implementation across European forces. Approval arrived on April 15 from Supreme Headquarters. Maintenance units across Europe were officially authorized to perform Hammond's upgrades, under the name Enhanced Mobility Program. Tank crews, however, simply called the results Hammond tanks or moonshine specials. By May 8, the day Germany surrendered, more than 300 Shermans had been upgraded. Units using the modified vehicles reported 23% fewer tank losses. On average, upgraded Shermans achieved 1.7 kills each, compared to only 1.1 for unmodified tanks. Before we continue with Hammond's long-term impact, if you haven't subscribed yet, please take a moment to do so now. These stories of American creativity and problem-solving deserve to be remembered. Be part of our community, subscribe today. Following the war, U.S. Army studies concluded that Hammond's work embodied exactly the type of battlefield innovation that should be encouraged. Continental Motors sent a team of engineers to interview Hammond personally. The company officials were embarrassed that a self-taught mechanic had discovered performance capabilities they had overlooked. Several of his improvements were later incorporated into post-war engine designs. Continental offered Hammond a consulting job. He turned it down, stating that he was finished working with engines. Technical Sergeant Curtis Hammond received the Bronze Star in May 1945. The award referenced his innovations, but it did not mention that they violated regulations. He was promoted to Master Sergeant and left the Army in November 1945. Returning to Tennessee, Hammond did not go back to moonshine production. Instead, he opened a modest repair shop in Gatlinburg focused on rebuilding and modifying engines. He lived a quiet life, rarely bringing up his wartime experience. He married in 1947, raised 3 children, and continued working until his retirement in 1979. In 1983, military historian Dr. Robert Zaloga uncovered Hammond's work in declassified documents, reached out to him, and recorded the details of the modification program. Zaloga's published research devoted an entire chapter to Hammond's contributions. In 1985, Hammond attended a reunion of the 3rd Armored Division, his first meeting with former comrades in 4 decades. Dozens of tank crews credited their survival to Hammond's upgrades. Soldiers formed lines just to thank him personally. A former tank commander told him, "Your changes saved my crew 2 different times. Once when we outran 3 Panthers, and again when we reached a bridge moments before the Germans could blow it up." His technical impact didn't end with World War II. The idea of modifying equipment based on real combat experience eventually became established doctrine. Future tanks were designed with larger performance reserves. Hammond's philosophy, evaluated in action, adjusted as needed, ignore rules when they fail, became permanently rooted in American military thinking. Curtis Hammond passed away on March 17, 1992, at 79 years old. His obituary briefly mentioned his military background but offered almost no real details. At the quiet private burial, over 50 elderly men attended. Many were former tankers who traveled from around the country. One fragile veteran approached Hammond's widow and quietly said, "Ma'am, your husband is the reason I'm alive. I was 19, driving a Sherman, terrified because German tanks were superior. Then I was assigned one of Curtis's modified tanks. The moment I felt how fast it could move, I realized I actually had a chance. That extra speed saved me 3 separate times. I'm here today, with children and grandchildren, because your husband figured out how to make a tank faster." Hammond's widow began to cry. These unexpected stories revealed a part of her husband's life she had only barely understood. The humble mechanic had changed tank warfare and prevented hundreds of deaths. In 2003, the National World War II Museum obtained one of the only remaining Shermans that Hammond had modified. Restoration experts brought it back to operational condition, keeping every upgrade intact. When it was demonstrated in 2004 with veterans in attendance, the engine roared to life and the vehicle accelerated at speeds that still looked unreal for a Sherman. The old soldiers smiled, and some wiped away tears. They were witnessing history running again. The museum's display includes full documentation, technical schematics, photographs, and first-hand accounts. A plaque reads, "Technical Sergeant Curtis Hammond increased the Sherman tank's speed by more than 70% without sacrificing reliability, through unauthorized experimentation and unwavering determination." His work reflects American battlefield ingenuity and shows that the greatest solutions often come from those directly facing the problem. Hammond's story presents deep questions about innovation, authority, and expertise. He had no formal engineering education, no official qualifications, and no sanctioned authority. Yet he carried immense practical understanding, fearless experimentation, and absolute trust in real-world results rather than theoretical assumptions. His background in moonshining turned out to be ideal training, demanding maximum engine output with limited tools and confidence even when experts insisted he was wrong. This narrative highlights the ongoing conflict between creativity and regulation. Rules existed for valid reasons, yet strict compliance could block progress. The Army's reaction matured appropriately, at first doubtful, but eventually supportive. That flexibility within the institution demonstrated the U.S. military at its finest, capable of recognizing and embracing innovation born from the field, not the rulebook. Every tanker whose life was spared by a tank that could accelerate quicker, every crew that survived because their Sherman could flee from deadly Panther tanks, every soldier who returned home because Hammond's upgrades gave them a fighting chance, these outcomes were the real measure of victory. Medals, history books, museum displays, those were honorable, but they were not the true reward. The greatest tribute was counted in lives preserved and families never forced to mourn. The wild genius who made Shermans fast enough to outrun jeeps proved that skill doesn't always wear a uniform or come from a classroom. Brilliant solutions often come from unlikely places, and when someone challenges accepted thinking with proven results, they can reshape the world. Curtis Hammond took wrecked tanks, damaged motors, and problems everyone swore were impossible to fix, and he turned them into high-powered machines that helped win a global war. He did it using moonshiner creativity, hands-on knowledge, bold instincts, and an unshakable belief that rules were optional when soldiers' lives hung in the balance. Those Continental engines inside his modified German tanks, pushed far past their official limits by a self-educated Tennessee mechanic, thundered across Europe in 1945 and carried American tank crews toward victory. They raced faster than engineers had ever predicted, survived harder than analysts claimed they could, and delivered results that critics insisted were impossible. They roared with power because Curtis Hammond understood something that no engineering degree alone could teach: every engine hides untapped strength waiting to be unleashed. Factory ratings are merely safe guidelines, and sometimes the thing everyone knows can't be done only means no one has dared to try it yet. The quickest Sherman of World War II, the tank that outsped a jeep, the legendary Moonshine Special that rewrote armored tactics, began life as a wrecked hulk and a crazy idea from a mechanic most people dismissed as insane. But Hammond showed the world that what looks like madness is often genius waiting for proof, and that the best solutions to impossible problems come from ignoring those who insist they cannot be solved and building the answer anyway. One ruined tank, one mechanic who refused to quit, and a machine that hit 47 miles per hour completely changed how people viewed a Sherman. That became the legacy of Technical Sergeant Curtis Lee Hammond, the moonshiner from Tennessee, the hot rod wizard who carved his name into military history and saved countless lives by refusing to believe that good enough was truly good enough. In a war powered by massive factories, the edge that made the difference sometimes didn't come from Detroit assembly lines, but from a maintenance tent in Germany, where a so-called madman with moonshiner instincts looked at a battered tank and didn't see what it was, he saw what it could be.